In the name of God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen. Poor Thomas always had a nickname. For a long time he was the twin, so he didn't even have a name to himself. And then comes that faithful day, the first day of the week, a week after the resurrection, and Thomas is forever branded Doubting Thomas. It's not that he was any different than any of the other disciples. Remember back to last week's lessons? Who were the first witnesses of the resurrection? The women who had come to take care of Jesus' body and found an empty tomb, and went racing back after having seen the risen Lord, and told all of the disciples, "Come see, Jesus is risen just like he said he would." And nobody believed them. Basically, they were waiting to be gathered in that room when Jesus came among them and said, "Here, look at my hands, look at my side. I'm real." So it wasn't really very strange that when they reported this to Thomas, he said, "I'm not going to believe it until I see it." This is not really an unusual response when somebody tells you that a person we saw die is walking around and living and active and with us. Nobody believed until they had seen. And what did Jesus do? Did he scold? Did he say, "All of the time we were moving towards Jerusalem, I was telling you I was going to die, but not to give up"? No, he doesn't say that. He knows that they're not going to believe until they see him, until they see the wounds in his hands, until they see the gash in his side, the proof that he had died. And knowing that they're not going to be able to continue on in the new ministry that he's given them, where they become apostles and not disciples, no longer students. Now they have been sent out to be Jesus, to continue to do his work, to be his hands and his feet and his eyes and his heart. And so he breathes on them the Holy Spirit, which is to be their advocate and their guide. It's really unusual because this is John's gospel. And he doesn't have another Pentecost where people receive the Holy Spirit in that very dramatic way in the temple in Jerusalem. No, he comes the very day of his resurrection. He comes among them and he breathes the Holy Spirit on them. And so this is Pentecost for the gospel according to John. Kind of nice. Because one of the things that he does in breathing the Holy Spirit into their lives and giving them new life in this new creation, he is also inviting them into partnership with him in this new creation, in the endeavors that are going to be taking place in this new world. Back in the 60s, there was a breath that many of us thought must be the Holy Spirit moving through the church. And there were a lot of fresh new things being talked about and envisioned, and one of the things that was just beginning to grow in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan was this concept that everybody who is baptized is a minister of the gospel and a member of Christ's new resurrected body, and that we are all ordained to go out as apostles, to carry that good news to the world. Well, one of the priests that came out of the Upper Peninsula and went to one of the more innovative seminaries in the church in Cambridge, which was ETS at the time, Episcopal Theology School, was a man named Martin Bell. And he was, as many of the priests from the 60s were, was a musician. He was a very innovative, creative thinker. And one of the things that he liked to do, besides opening coffee shops where people could talk about important things, like, what does this all mean to us? He liked to write parables, little things that would help people with this new consciousness of their own ministry hear the gospel in different ways. And so his meditations and parables and songs and poems were gathered into a little book called The Way of the Wolf, which is still in print, has not gone out of print since it was first published. And when I hear today's lesson, I always think of one of the parables in The Way of the Wolf called The Ragtag Army. And I'd like to read that for you today. I think God must be very old and very tired. Maybe he used to look splendid and fine in his general's uniform, but no more. He's been on the march a long time, you know, and look at his ragtag little army. All he has for soldiers are you and me. Dumb little army. Listen, the drumbeat isn't even regular. Everyone is out of step. And there, you see, God keeps stopping along the way to pick up one of his tinier soldiers who decided to wander off and play with a frog, or run in a field, or whose foot got tangled in the underbrush. He'll never get anywhere that way. And yet, the march goes on. Do you see how the marchers have broken up into little groups? Look at that group up near the front. Now there's a snappy outfit. They all look pretty much alike. At least they're in step with each other. That's something. Only they're not wearing their shoes. They're carrying them in their hands. Silly little band. They won't get far before God will have to stop again. Or how about that other group over there? They're all holding hands as they march. The only trouble with this is the people on each end of the line. Pretty soon, they realize that one of their hands isn't holding on to anything. One hand is reaching, empty, alone. And so they hold hands with each other, and everybody marches around in circles. The more people holding hands, the bigger the circle. And of course, a bigger circle is deceptive, because as we march along, it looks like we're going someplace, but we're not. And so God must stop again. See what I mean? He'll never get anywhere that way. If God were more sensible, he'd take his little army and shape them up. Why, who ever heard of a soldier stopping to romp in a field? It's ridiculous, but even more absurd is a general who will stop the march of eternity, to go and bring him back. But that's God for you. His is no endless, empty marching. He is going somewhere. His steps are deliberate and purposive. He may be old and he may be tired, but he knows where he's going, and he means to take every last one of his tiny soldiers with him. Only there aren't going to be any forced marches. And after all, there are frogs and flowers and thorns and underbrush along the way. And even though our foreheads have been signed with the sign of the cross, we are only human. And most of us are afraid and lonely and would like to hold hands or cry or run away. And we don't know where we're going, and we can't seem to trust God, especially when it's dark out and we can't see him. And he won't go on without us, and that's why it's taking so long. Listen, the drumbeat isn't even regular. Everyone is out of step. And there, you see, God keeps stopping along the way to pick up one of his tinier soldiers who decided to wander off and play with a frog or run in the field or whose foot got tangled in the underbrush. He'll never get anywhere that way. And yet, the march goes on. Thomas was one of the tiny soldiers who had to be waited for. All of the disciples were tiny soldiers who had to be waited for. As apostles, they made several attempts to get it right, and sometimes they succeeded, and sometimes they ran off to play with a frog. Just like many of us who march in lockstep, going in circles, or us when we can't seem to find the rhythm of marching together, or us when we wander off to chase the bright, tempting things that distract us along the way. Still, God is patient, never forcing, never leaving us behind, and always knowing where we're going, even when we don't know. Always providing the strength, the guidance, the nurture, and the assurance that we need when it's hard to see him. We still welcome new soldiers into the ragtag army of God, whether it be in baptism or evangelical effort or just happenstance. And isn't it encouraging that they will be given time to grow in faith? They'll be given loving people who will support them in faith and share their own faith journeys with them. They will find a loving God who will wait patiently for them when they wander off to play with a frog or run in the fields, who will pick them up and dust them off when they get stuck, who will love them always, even when faith is difficult, when they need to be able to experience God with all their senses. The same God who loves us all when we need to see him and to touch his wounds and to experience him with all our senses. Just as all people of faith, have needed from time to time, from that time in that closed room, when Thomas put into words what everybody else in the room was thinking and feeling. And Jesus obliges. Amen.